Broadcast is now starting.
We have several school leaders from across the country who are prepared to share some key insights they have learned over the years. Before we begin, I want to again remind you and encourage the participants in today's session to feel free to submit questions through the chat box on your computer. We will also reserve some time at the end of the session for a question and answer time. So please enter your questions and we will certainly get to those throughout the session as time permits, either during the presentation or at the end. With that said, I want to jump into our first topic today, which is dealing with challenging people. And I have to wonder what it would be like if we all went to work every day and everyone was cooperative. Unfortunately, the reality is we are going to encounter difficult people along the way. If you haven't already, just wait, you will. Principal of Columbia Falls Junior High School in Montana, Dave Wick, will enlighten us to skills and tips he has found helpful in dealing with challenging people.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Wick, as Brian said, and thank you so much for the introduction, Brian. And to all you assistant principals out there, I want to say thank you for your service to our students. I spent my day yesterday thanking our assistant principal at our school. They do a great work within all of our schools, so really appreciate that. And yes, I've dealt with a lot of difficult people over the years, and so I have really two different areas. If we could move to the next slide, we'll see the first one, and that's really dealing, I'm going to talk a little bit about dealing with difficult people in terms of parents first. One of the things that I suggest that you do when you have a parent coming in and you are aware that they're angry about something, I try to assess the situation as quickly as I can. What's the level of anger? If I really think it's a threatening situation, I will try to involve our school resource officer and have a police presence there if needed. Very rarely does that happen, but at times I have done that. I assess the situation and try to decide if the need is immediate or can it wait until tomorrow. I found a strategy that works for me. If a parent calls at 4:30 in the afternoon and I receive the message, I don't always call them back right away, especially if I know the parent. I may call them back in the morning and say, I was in a meeting, and it allows them some cool-off time. So one of the suggestions I always have is to allow someone to cool off, and usually time makes them less angry, and so that's been a strategy over the years that I've used quite a bit. I often, in assessing the situation, decide if I should have other witnesses there, sometimes other people's presence, the school counselor, my assistant principal, or someone else to be the witness during the conversation. Sometimes calms the anger of the person also. In my mind, I set ground rules. I don't tell the parent overtly what I'm going to, what my ground rules are, but they're very clear once the conversation starts. And for example, I demand that they have a respectful conversation with me, no profanity or threats of any kind, and if those things happen, I tell them that this conversation is over until they can calm down and use appropriate language, because that's what I'm going to do with them. So it's an example of one of the ground rules I set. I project an open body image and tone with them. I try to be very open when I talk with them. I move my chair up from behind my desk, and that reduces the perceived power differences. If you sit behind your desk, they're on the other side. Sometimes that increases their perception that they're not going to be listened to and that you have all the power. I always get a notebook out and start taking notes, and go into my office and get a notebook. If I don't have one, go into the conference room with them. I also use some catchphrases. I always use a phrase like, how may I help you today? What can I do for you today? And so they see that I'm there to serve them. The fourth bullet is there 3 times repeated. Listen, 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 because it's the most important one. I take notes while listening to what they're saying. I'm nodding, agreeing. I find points of agreement with them. I try to come to consensus with them. One of the examples I used is, well, I'll say something like, well, no one would want that for your child, or I have my own children, I understand your frustration. And as we're trying to work through these things, try to find points of comparison between the two of us and points of agreement. Sometimes that anger that they have will wind down after a few minutes of very intentional listening. The fifth thing I say is that I'm going to offer solutions. Sometimes I can give them an immediate solution. If that's possible, I tell them I will take care of this right now. I know how to take care of this, or I'll say, let me go get the person. I'm happy to have them come down with me, and we'll get this taken care of right away. If they go on and they're really not listening, they're angry enough that they're not listening at all, I ask them, would it be okay for me to respond now? And if they're still angry, I tell them, let's plan another meeting or a telephone call later. And almost always I'll say to them, may I look into this and get back to you, because usually they're not angry at me, they're angry at someone else. And so I'll tell them that I want to look into the situation. The next point is I discuss the varying perceptions. I talk about student perceptions, and at the middle school level, I tell the parents, I don't believe your child is lying, but I'm not sure this is accurate. So I tell them, sometimes at this age, perceptions are exaggerated, and so maybe we can find exactly what happened. They came home and told their parent that something very dramatic has happened, and it may not always be the case. Another suggestion about discussing these things with parents, I learned early on, I never say never. I started a few years ago, I had a comment where a parent told me this is what a teacher did, and I said, Mr. So-and-so would never do that. I found out that he did do that, so you might have to eat your words. So I would suggest that you never say it would never happen. So, say, well, that doesn't sound like Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, but let me look into it. And so if a person, in the last bullet there, is handling continuing disagreements, if it's somebody that I know well and they've kind of been a thorn to the school, and I have I make time to see those people, but I also set boundaries, and I'll tell my secretary, in about 10 minutes, please come knock on my door, remind me about the meeting I have, and we have some ways that, so I don't spend all my time with those people who really are just looking for that time. If it's a continuing disagreement, sometimes I have to say I might have to agree to disagree with you. And finally, if I just can't come to anything positive with the person, I tell them, here's our superintendent's phone number, and I'd be happy for you to discuss this with him or her. And then I call the superintendent to make sure they know it's coming. If we could move to the next slide. That has to do with dealing with difficult staff, and I'm happy to say I don't have any difficult staff right now, but have had over the years. And so the first thing is we have to anticipate there's going to be problems. Just because people are educators doesn't mean they will not have any issues. Things happen to people that we hire change, they go through turmoil, and it's just obvious that they're human too, so we're definitely going to have issues within our building as the year goes on of some kind or another. The next bullet I wrote was don't be reactive, but don't ignore, and it's different from my third point, which is being proactive. So let me explain what I mean by that. Ignoring behavior is accepting behavior. So if people are talking during your staff meeting, and I've heard some nightmarish stories about people sitting in the back of a staff meeting with a newspaper, and I just never ignore any of those behaviors. I have to make sure that I'm going to not be reactive to them, but I obviously don't ignore those either. Remember that from the very start, people are watching everything you do. They're expecting you to model in words and deed everything that they expect from their administrator. They'll start with an initial impression of you, and they will observe every interaction. I always keep my anger and frustration under control. Had it yesterday in a staff meeting, some things that happened, and I just kind of nodded and said, thank you for your input, even though I was not appreciative of what the person was saying. So even though you might not be very happy with something, it's best not to show it. In a very professional way, I point out unwanted behaviors. So I have, for example, if I'm in a staff meeting and people are talking, I just stop and I look at them until it's quiet again, and then we begin. And if things were consistently disrespectful, I would follow protocol. I have on occasion had to write someone up for continuing misbehaviors within our building. So being proactive is a little different. It means going out and talking to the people, finding out what people think. And the people who are against things that we have tried to do within our school, I draw them close usually and find out what exactly it is that they want and what their needs are. I try to separate them from a group of people and meet with them as an individual. I'm very honest and forthright, and I'm always identifying the unwanted behaviors. Here's what I need from you. I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. I do find that using humor is really important in being proactive and making people realize that some of the problems that they're really perseverating on are not all that important. And again, I've written listen, and that means I try to take the input of the people who are being difficult, and I use it when possible. Every time you use something that they suggest, they're kind of surprised, and then they tend to start to appreciate things that you're doing that they may not agree with. I explicitly show how I'm going to act and talk. I use some phrases like, I don't know what you're used to, but this is how I deal with things. I use the phrase, this is what you can expect from me. And then I tell them explicitly what I expect. So I say, this is what I need from you, though we may disagree, we may need to do so privately. And I'll say something like, when you disagree, you'll always be respectful and you can expect the same from me. And finally, I recommend solutions. I offer solutions to problems that are identified by the person. And sometimes I even say, if we're not the place for you, I'm happy to facilitate a transfer for you or something else that would make you more happy, but we're still going to move forward, even though you may not agree with the method that we're using at this particular time. And usually they see the good more than the bad things. So that's my timer. I am done with my 10 minutes. Sorry to turn that off. And I greatly appreciate your listening. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take the time to visit with you at any time. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Dave. Navigating those tough conversations and people can certainly present a challenge, so we appreciate your guidance on such an important topic. As you all know, yeah, thank you. As you all know, relationship building is essential for school success. Our faculty, staff, students, and all stakeholder groups know when school leadership is cohesive or sadly divided. So when thinking about your current relationship with your direct supervisor, you need to ask yourself, how can the relationship be strengthened to ensure a strong leadership team? Joining us today to lead this discussion is Sharon McNary, principal of Richland Elementary School in Memphis, Tennessee.
Hi there, Brian, and thank you, and happy Assistant Principals Week to all of you. And I hope that you're having a great week. As Brian said, I will be talking on strengthening the assistant principal relationship. The first thing is that two-way communication is imperative for a strong principal-AP relationship. And all of my years as an assistant principal and a principal, we have always ensured that we had two-way communication. There's not a thing that goes on in this building that I do that my assistant principal doesn't know, and there's not a thing that goes on that my assistant principal does that I don't know about. And it doesn't mean that I don't trust my assistant principal or that I'm micromanaging. It's just that in our busy schedules, we can go all day without seeing each other. And there can be a really hot situation that needs to, that is being handled by him or by myself. And if the other one doesn't know and one of us steps out and, and that parent or that teacher calls again, or they go to our district, to the superintendent's office, and they call one of us, we need to know what's going on at all times so that we also can address it. So we make sure that we have. So the big thing is make sure to find time to meet with your principal. Sometimes it's as easy as just sending an email, or a text if you can't meet, and, hey, I just want you to know that this happened today, and this is how I handled it. Always let know how, I do the same thing, and this is how I handled it. There's times when I go down to my assistant principal and say, this is how I handled it. What do you think? Could I've done it differently? And so, I'm constantly, seeking feedback, and so, and he does the same. So to, but sometimes it requires more. It requires in fact, I got a message a little while ago from my assistant principal saying we need to talk today. And so making sure that before the day's over that we do have time to sit and talk and to, find out what's going on so that we are apprised of the situations in the school. I always make sure the principal that I do include my assistant principal in all aspects of running the school. That my goal is to train the assistant principal so that he or she will then become a principal one day. And so, of course, we want him or her to do more than, the books and buses and so forth, and to, be the instructional leader. At the same time, though, we always, the assistant principal tries to take over some of the duties that could tie up the principal from being that instructional leader in the building. And so, the way we do it here is that the assistant principal tries to be the first one to meet with the students and the parents, and at times the teachers, if possible, before going to the principal. And we do that for many reasons, but one reason, especially with parents, and we always have the parents go to the teachers first, and then the assistant principal, but we always tell the parents, if you start with me, then you're still not satisfied, you have nowhere else to go. But, out of the school, and we try to solve problems so it doesn't get to that district, level. But it also just helps so that, a lot of times the problems can be resolved with the assistant principal, and so that does free up so that the principal is able to do the other things, all the other demands that are required of a principal. So that's just something that we've put in place that helps and works well for us. As I said a few minutes ago, I go and bounce ideas off my assistant principal all the time, and so both parties should share best practices with each other. And the day that you stop learning is the day that you need to get out of education. And so I'm always, asking his advice and learning from him as much as he's learning from me. And because he does do a lot more of the student discipline when he is out of the building or something. And there are times like, because it's been a while that, I might touch base with them and say, hey, what do you think? How do you think this should be handled? And so if you have ideas and things like that, best practice or things that you've seen or something, please share them with your principal and make sure those lines of communication are open. And so that your principal and your teachers and students are all learning, that we're all learning from each other, and we're all holding each other accountable too. And so that to me is a good way of strengthening that relationship, to share your ideas. Don't always be the one that is just taking, but give also by sharing those ideas. And my last advice is always display a united front. Now, we're all not always going to agree with each other, but you don't want the stakeholders to pit one against each other. I always say the mommy daddy, that they go to the one and they don't like that answer, then they go to the other one. And so to make sure that we do have that united front, so that that they aren't trying to pit each other, that pit the principal against the assistant principal, and so that we do stand together. Now, of course, if we disagree, we're going to talk about it together alone, just like, parents do, but we're not going to ever let the teachers or the students or the parents or any other stakeholders see that we disagree. And we will talk about it, and, and I might say, well, next time, here's a different way to handle it, and so forth. But thank you for listening, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
All right. Thank you, Sharon, for sharing your insight and wisdom. You're welcome. Among the myriad of administrative responsibilities is that of instructional leadership. Here to help us better understand critical practices of instructional leaders is Deborah Frazier, principal of Chancellor Middle School in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Hello, everyone. And as everyone said previously, thank you for your work that you do as assistant principals. Our job certainly could not go forward and be as productive as it is without the assistance of our assistant principals. I'm here today to talk to you about the instructional role of the assistant principal. I think that the role is very synonymous, the role of the principal as an instructional leader and the role as an assistant principal as an instructional leader. And I have a few tips that will help kind of summarize this thought for you. If you want to move forward in the principalship, you cannot think of yourself as just an assistant principal. You think of yourself as one day I am going to fill the role of a principal. And I'm not saying that everyone will want to leap into that position, but certainly I think that the goal that I have always for the 9 principals that I've sent forth, the 9 assistant principals that I've sent forth as principals, I shared with them that I wanted them to think of their role as a principal and not just as an assistant. When I think of the role, the instructional role of a principal or assistant principal, I think it is a collaborative development to sustain a shared vision and to help create a learning community. The learning community encompasses everyone, your staff, your students, your parents, your community, the school division, your school board office, bringing everyone into that shared vision that you have prepared or established as your school's vision and goals. It's important for you to have that shared vision and to articulate that with your extended community. And we are moving away from just looking only at professional learning communities and looking at a learning community within our schools. And so the one thing that we always want to be mindful of, that if you want to grow your learning community, all stakeholders must feel a part of that, or you are going to become stagnant. So find ways that you can bring everyone into the discussion about what is needed, how do you get things done, how keeping others informed, your leadership team, your parent community, your PTA, all of that starts the instructional leadership. The other piece is to know what's going on in your classrooms. And what one of the things that I learned years ago, I've been in high school, I've been in middle school and elementary. And I think the first time I went into a 11th grade U.S. history classroom, and I'm like, my gosh, I don't remember all this stuff in U.S. history. How can I evaluate what's going on with my teachers? And one of the things that that became very apparent to me was that I needed to know what good instruction looked like. And so therefore, I needed to know what are the things that I'm going to walk into that classroom and what do I want to see. So I have created a visible walkthrough form. And that walkthrough form is just a snapshot that will tell me what's going on in that classroom, regardless if it's algebra, pre-algebra, geometry, 8th grade English, 6th grade science. I can walk into the classroom and say, what are my students learning today? What are the students learning? I can also ask, how are they learning that? And how will they know that they've learned it? And no matter what class I walk into, that simple walkthrough form that gives me those points help me not to focus on what the teacher is teaching, but what the students are learning. So I'm taking the focus off of always looking to see if there's a lesson plan written, or is that teacher following that lesson plan? What is that teacher doing? I'm no longer concerned with what the teacher's doing. I'm now concerned with what my students are learning. So that visible walkthrough form just helped me to put things in perspective and to know what is happening on a daily basis in that classroom, I don't have to know all the content. I know a lot of it, but it's impossible for me to know every single standard or strand that my students are learning. I want to know, are they learning and how they're doing it? And so when I have a conversation with my teachers, or when you will have a conversation with teachers, as assistant principal, I think that's your role. Your role is to talk instruction with your teachers. Here at our school, we have 870 students, and it's just my assistant principal and me. So the two of us, we have a big job. We share the discipline So he and I both make sure that the discipline is handled, and he basically does most of special ed. But everything else we share jointly. Discipline, cafeteria duty, instruction, observation of teachers, walkthrough, those kinds of things are shared equally. And so having those conversations with teachers about what you're actually seeing. You either see it or you don't. And it's a very easy conversation to say, I didn't see that. Help me to understand what you were trying to teach today in your classroom, rather than getting to the nitty-gritty piece of, well, I didn't see you mention this vocabulary in your lesson today. That comes, but it's not the first thing that you would look for in a walkthrough. Those are things that you come as you go and you do longer observations of the classroom. Then you want to make sure that the content matches what is being taught, because that's important as well. I think the other piece, as a system principal and as the instructional leader, you're connecting with your students will help your students to connect in classes. So your students need to see you. And one of the things that we do, we're constantly out in the building. We can get tied up in the office looking at referrals or getting bogged down with parents coming in the day. What I've created is this communication form where when my parents come in to meet with me, if it's not a life or death situation and someone is not hurt or ill, my parents have to leave a note for my assistant principal, for me, as well as some of my other staff, because our focus first thing in the morning is to start the instructional day with as less of an interruption as possible to the flow of what's going on daily. So we have our parents to fill out that form, and it's 24 hours. We get back with them within that 24 hours. That allows us to be in the classroom, focus on students, focus on instruction. The other piece is to monitor what's going on in your classroom as far as the data is concerned. So you're getting snapshots with walkthroughs, but you also have an opportunity to look at how your students are performing. Rather that's a benchmark assessment, rather that's some kind of summative assessment that you give twice a year or at the end of the year. Keeping a pulse on the data and talking about ways that you can improve is essential. That is the role not only of the principal, but the assistant principal should be entrenched into looking at snapshots of how your kids are doing along the way. Therefore, you're not surprised at the end of the year when your students don't do as well as expected, because the monitoring piece was not there. So you have that visual walkthrough, but you also have a pulse on the data, and you're seeing what happens throughout the year instead of at the beginning of the year where your students come in, and at the end of the year when you get those test scores. Because that can be pretty stressful if you don't have an idea how your students are going to perform at the end. There's some resources that are very helpful and have been helpful to me. And one of the books that I reference as an instructional leader is the book by Thomas Sergiovanni, and it is Rethinking Leadership, a collective of articles. That book is really helpful in helping me to just make sure that I'm staying with what's expected instructionally, because no matter how long you've done this job, you still have a learning curve. There are things that you still have to make sure that you're on top of, because instruction and learning for kids is evolving constantly. The other book that I reference as a basic guide is called A Basic Guide to Supervision and Instructional Leadership, and it's by Carl D. Glickman, Stephen Gordon and Javita Ross Gordon. And these books really help me to look at ways that I can strengthen the instructional leadership within our building. So those are some tips that I have. I hope that they've been helpful to you, and the things that I would encourage you to do is not to become stressed out about how long you do an observation, but what meaning does that snapshot bring to you more frequently. I would rather get into one class 10 times than one class 2 times for 45 minutes. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Deborah. We appreciate that information. And I know there were some questions about whether or not those resources could be available that you were talking about. I certainly would also encourage any of the participants to feel free to email the presenters directly if you have a question or like to get some further information or resources sent to you from them. They would be happy to share that. I'm sure their emails are located on the presentation, but you can also find their emails on NASB.org, where under meeting the board of directors and the staff. All of the presenters today are on our board of directors, and their contact information is located on the NASP website. So as you all know, many assistant principals are tasked with the responsibility of leading IEP teams within the school. Often when it comes to leadership for students with disabilities, this role can be challenging. Joining us today to help provide some clarity on this important role, we have Dr. Susan Cobb, Principal of Center School and Executive Director of Covered Bridge Special Education District in Terre Haute, Indiana.
Thanks, Brian. Hello, and thanks to all of you for joining this webinar and panel discussion today. And also, so I don't forget, Happy Assistant Principals Week. It's great to have a week that celebrates and honors the work that you do, and we certainly, as principals, know how important you are in our lives. So I know it's very difficult to discuss everything that you need to know about special education in 5 to 10 minutes, so I'll touch on a few key points that I believe will benefit you as an assistant principal. And as Brian said, feel free to email me with any questions. I'll be happy to help you with resources. My first slide, as you can see here, is covered or littered with special education terms. The world of special education uses many acronyms that can be very daunting. I've also learned that each state has its own acronyms for some of the same terms, and this can be even more confusing to someone who's new to special education. And if you live close to a state border like I do, then you need to know the terms and acronyms for your state and maybe the adjoining states, and it can be very taxing, but it is important to know the differences. As an AP, your role in a case conference or an ACR, annual case review, is likely that of a PAR, or public agency representative, and this is also known as a case conference coordinator. Your role is to ensure that what is agreed upon in that meeting can and will be followed through in the school and in the child's IEP. In other words, if you agree to allow a student to use a certain type of technology, then you need to make sure that you can provide it or the school corporation can provide it. If you do not believe that you can provide a service or accommodation for any reason, and typically that's a financial reason, then you should not agree to it in that conference, because if you agree to it, then you're held accountable. If you don't feel that you have the authority to authorize something that may come up in a case conference or an ACR, maybe that you weren't expecting, then you simply just need to say that you need to investigate that or research that idea and that you would get back to them. Never commit to anything that you're not sure you can provide. The IEP is a binding agreement and it is upheld by law, so whatever you agree to and whatever you put in that is law and you have to follow it. So you have to be careful. Sometimes we say things, especially if you're new to special ed, you may agree to something in a meeting and not realize the consequences that can play into that. When it comes to the IEP process, if you've been a special education teacher prior to being an administrator, then you definitely have an advantage. As an AP, your role is to review IEPs and become familiar with the lingo and the process. You need to have a good understanding of the law and how to stay out of a due process hearing. And we'll talk a little bit more about due process hearings here in a minute. When you're in a meeting, it's best if you remain the neutral party and act on the behalf of the child. Let the teacher of record or the classroom teacher present the academic information, and then the parent can provide the personal information or personal input. Often the school and the parent may not agree, and this is when a parent might decide to bring an advocate to the meeting. I know that's sometimes scary, especially if you haven't been in a meeting with an advocate. Kind of feels like you're put on the defensive. But my advice is not to perceive the advocate as an enemy or fear the advocate, because typically these people can see the big picture and they always act on the behalf of the child. And sometimes you're afraid they may take the parent side because the parent invites them. But in my experience, they typically choose the child and work for the child. So I want to talk a little bit about due process. As an AP and principal, I was in 3 different schools over 12 years, and I never had a due process hearing. I'd been a special education teacher prior to administration, so I had that to my advantage. So I was not involved in any due process hearings until this year when I took over as the special education director for my district. What I have learned is that at the school level, too often the administration wants to ensure that the meeting goes the way they want it to, and there's not enough collaboration, communication, or flexibility within the meeting and with the parents. You cannot go into an IEP meeting with a predetermined notion about how things are going to go in that meeting. This will get you into trouble every time. You can staff a conference and have a plan, but you need to be prepared if that plan doesn't go the way you want it to. So remember, the student and the parent are your clients. You need to work with them and ensure that the needs of the child are being met. Another tip to share is that if you know a meeting has not gone well and the family is unhappy, have them contact your special education director or maybe your superintendent and schedule another meeting. Typically that person, whoever the next person up on that food chain is, can look at things in a more neutral way, or at least the parents will perceive it to be a more neutral set of eyes. In Indiana, we now have a place on the DOE website where parents can file a complaint electronically, and then that complaint comes to me as a special education director. And then I only have 10 days to resolve that issue before it goes to a due process hearing that is facilitated by the state. My schools here typically are surprised that it can go straight to the state level and bypass me as the director without me having my knowledge, or knowledge of the incident, but I believe that's probably something that most states are going to. So that's a difficult hurdle to overcome as well. I actually have a meeting on Monday with one of my schools and families to try to resolve an issue where the parent filed with the state, filed a complaint, and I had absolutely no knowledge of what was going on. So I have to quickly try to facilitate a meeting with the school and the family and try to come to some agreement. But if we can't come to an agreement, that's when it'll go right up to the state level, and a facilitator will come in and be that neutral party. So I think as an AP or principal, you have to give a little bit and you have to compromise. If you can't compromise, you're probably going to end up in a due process hearing. Compromise is sometimes difficult, or it feels like you're giving up maybe something that you need, but a lot of times, especially with these difficult cases, you give a little bit now and you'll get dividends back later. So compromise is key. I would also advise you as the AP to become familiar with PBIS, that's Positive Behavior Intervention Supports, as well as RTI or intervention strategies. These supports are definitely going to come in handy when you're sitting in those case conferences. Frequently, the parents and the teacher will look to you for advice and suggestions that they may not have thought of yet. So you need to be familiar with some strategies that you can pull out of your pocket and suggest. It's also nice to know some different academic apps that could benefit families at home. For example, one, and I'm certainly not endorsing it, but IXL is a great resource for assisting students and parents with academics. Parents are able to log in and build accounts and get graphics and charts about how their children are doing. Another suggestion I throw out a lot at case conferences is to use the app called Prismo Go, and this allows you to take a picture of a reading passage, and it will read it back to the student at whatever pace the adult chooses. It will also record the student reading, and so this often is very beneficial for students that are selective mutes. I don't know if you've run into selective mute students, but a lot of times they won't speak at school, and so this is an app we use a lot where they can record work at home and then share it with the teacher later. So that's always good to have some things in your back pocket that you can share. My next advice is to support your teachers through professional development. They need to continually work on their practice, and they can't do it without support. And this doesn't have to be costly. There are a lot of free resources out there that can be helpful, including resources that NAESP can provide you. Classroom teachers don't have the time to research certain concepts or ideas, and you can do that for them. You can always assist the principal in developing a plan where teachers can have a common plan time or common collaboration time. I would also suggest developing some plan where special education teachers can have release time to either co-teach with general education teachers or to get a better grasp on the curriculum by observing those gen ed teachers. And they can also observe their students in the gen ed setting to see if they are appropriately meeting their needs. Okay, so now you see the next slide. This is some resources that I think will help you and answer some questions. They're great resources just to have at your fingertips. First, feel comfortable to reach out to your local special education director. Sometimes when you're out in the field, you feel like you don't want to bother that person that may be at the top of the food chain, let's say. But truthfully, it may save you time later, especially if it's just troubleshooting a situation or a problem with the family. They typically have a lot of knowledge, and they know the families. You know, a lot of times it's the same families that have problems over and over. So no question is a bad question. You're better off to seek advice and than to end up in due process because you were afraid to ask. You can also access your State Department Education website and find resources on the Special Education Division section. The U.S. Department of Education has great resources as well, and these are broader and not as tailored to your State Department, so it kind of serves as a different need. Also a book that's well worth your money. It's called A Principal's Guide to Special Education by David F. Bateman and C. Fred Bateman. I actually saw David speak at last year's national conference, and I had to purchase this book. It's great to quickly look up a question or a topic and get an answer. It's a quick read, but it can also be used like a manual. It's also a good idea to have a copy on your desk or nearby shelf, or maybe bookmarked on your computer of the IDEA law, Article 7, and then the procedural safeguards that you use, because those are just quick, handy resources that may answer questions. Finally, I included some websites on here for co-teaching. PBIS and the Council on Exceptional Children has a lot of resources that may benefit you. So remember, you do not have to know everything. You just need to know how to access the information you need. So I thank you all for your time today. I wish you well, and feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. I would just also add in your section there, as the AP in the role of special education, oftentimes when you're in those meetings, although the special education teacher may be leading that meeting, it's your responsibility as administrator to help that meeting move along. And so oftentimes the teachers will depend on you to help navigate some of those tough conversations that Dave and others have talked about today, and making sure that meeting is moving along and and that you're being sensitive to time, but certainly not rushing through that meeting. Okay, well, thank you everyone who contributed today. Perhaps during our time together a question surfaced or you would like further clarification about an area that was discussed. So at this time we can entertain any questions that you may have. Certainly you can chat through, list that through the chat room, and we can open it up for our panelists to help answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, actually, Brian, we have a question from Carol about this was during Deborah's session about will the visible walkthrough form Principal Fraser is discussing be presented? Is there a place, Deborah, that you can talk about where the communication forms and the visible walkthrough forms can be found?
The visible walkthrough form that we have is one that we developed for our school division. I don't mind sharing that walkthrough. Our school division developed that one. I do have one that I personally did myself, and I don't have any problems with anybody duplicating that one at all. So I'll get that to you, Honor, and we can just share it with everyone.
Okay. And what about communication form?
Oh, the communication form is my form. I developed that form, and so it's kind of my trademark, but I'll share that as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'll send it to you. I'll email it to you, and you can share it out, because that form saves a lot of time. We try not to have just impromptu meetings with parents. If they come in, we might reschedule. We'll ask them to fill out a form, or we just don't want things to tie us up from what we have to do daily. If it's an emergency and it's very important, we'll meet. But if it's not, we try to reschedule a meeting. But I'll be glad to share that communication form.
Okay, thank you.
And again, I would encourage anyone to feel free to email the panelists and directly, and they'll be happy to send you any information that they're able to share as well.
I think that's about it, Brian.
Okay, great. Well, it's been a great time together today, but this is only the beginning. We'd like to keep these conversations going. Topics such as these today, specifically designed for assistant principals and leaders of all pre-K-8 levels, will be shared at the NASP Summer Conference, July 9th through the 11th in Orlando, Florida. We invite you to join us. Sean Covey, Daniel Pink, and Sal Khan are just a few of the renowned keynote speakers who will be sharing at our spectacular event. There will be countless concurrent sessions, networking opportunities, and vendors to serve the needs of all pre-K-8 principals and assistant principals. So we hope you're able to join us. As instructional leaders in our buildings, we see NASP as our go-to source for principal leadership, and would encourage you to check out the NASP website to help you in building your professional knowledge and network. We wish you much success as you move through the remainder of the school year. As always, if anyone at NASP can assist you in your leadership journey, please do not hesitate to reach out. Have a great afternoon, and thanks again for joining us. And once again, happy Assistant Principals.